Thank you for joining today's Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris, and I'm delighted today to be introducing the topic of the role of culture in English language teaching. Today's topic is the role of culture in English language teaching, because I believe that not only is language and culture indistinguishable. They're two sides of the same coin, as it were. But I also believe the very strong arguments for the explicit incorporation of culture in its widest sense in the language classroom itself. So as I said previously, my name is Neil Harris. I'm the Director of Marketing and Lead Teacher Trainer on a number of teacher training courses here in Cardiff, where I work. And I've had an interest in the teaching of culture, both embedded in language classes and also as the topic of courses themselves for many years. So I can't cover everything today, but I thought the areas that were most needing of coverage are here on screen. So we're going to begin by looking at what do we actually mean by culture generally, as well as for the English language teaching classroom. We'll then look at the interface between published learning materials, typically course books, and culture. And then we'll move on to look at the topic of cultural dimensions, which may be something that is new to a number of you. And then at the end, I'll draw some final conclusions. So let's begin then by asking the question, what exactly do we mean by culture? And I think it's fair to say that if you ask 10 people, you're going to get 10 different answers. And that's fine. So I'm just going to pause here for a few moments to allow you some thinking time to consider what does culture mean to you? And if you'd like, a few moments to type some short answers into the chat box so that we can share some ideas. So as those ideas start coming in, I'd like at the same time to share with you some thoughts of what culture may already mean to a number of you. So when you hear the word culture, perhaps you think of something like ballet, theatre, or opera. In other words, high culture. Alternatively, you might think about what we might refer to as low, or more frequently now known as popular culture. This is the logo for a very famous TV reality show, Big Brother, that was shown in many countries, and which I think if you start watching what happens in Big Brother households in different countries, it's a wonderful way of actually having a look into different cultures and different cultural behaviors. And then finally, you might start thinking of something like the Japanese tea ceremony as a manifestation of traditional culture. And of course, all of these are absolutely correct. They are all ways of looking at culture. But there are, in fact, other ones perhaps which are less visible, and which therefore we don't immediately think of. So, for example, when I asked you that question a few moments ago, what do you think of when you think of the word culture? Did any of you think of time, or indeed gender roles, or even humour as being manifestations of culture? Because they all are. Now, you might think, how on earth can time be a manifestation of culture? Time is the same all around the world. And of course, yes, we all have pretty much 365 days in a year, 12 months in the year, 7 days in the week, and so on. But our attitude to time is culturally coded. So to give you a quick example, here in the UK, it's a bit of a cliche, I know. It's a stereotype of our cultural behaviour. The queue is very important. we all have to respect the queue and never jump the queue. That is, go to the front of the queue or stand in front of someone else who is already queuing. Whereas in Italy, I think we can see that the queue manifests itself quite differently. So, for example, if you're in a butcher's buying meat, and the first person in the queue is buying, for example, some beef, then the butcher behind the counter might ask, does anyone else require beef, before she or he puts it back into the fridge. And the reason for this is that some cultures tend towards polychronic time, whereas UK culture tends towards monochronic time. In the UK, the first person would be served beef, the second person might buy sausages, the third person might buy bacon, and then the fourth person asks for beef. Whereas in other countries, the first and the fourth people would be served possibly at the same time, because that is seen as a way of actually saving time rather than opening and closing the fridge, going to get different joints, different cuts of meats, one after another. So we can see in that very simple example how time can be a cultural issue. So I've already mentioned this idea of things which are visible and things which are less visible. So that brings us on to the idea of the cultural iceberg, which is a really nice metaphor for the elements of culture which we can see all around us and those which are less easy to see. And coming up on this next slide here now, you'll see exactly that. So here, above the surface of the water, are those visible, easy to see manifestations of culture. Language, the food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, and indeed greetings. So for example, a friend of mine in Germany explained that in her department, which was a Ministry of Education, even after 25 years, she greeted her close colleagues by their surname, Frau Sackhalkwitz, rather than Angela, as a case in point. Beneath the line here, we have those less visible, not so easy to see manifestations of culture. And here you can see humor that was on the previous slide, but also beliefs, core values, gender roles, something else that we saw on that slide as well. So it's very easy to forget that when we're dealing with different cultures, we're not only dealing with what is manifested above the waterline, the visible aspects of culture, but much less easy to understand because they're not visible, but also importantly, as in the case with the iceberg, much more numerous and arguably more important are the large number of cultural manifestations below the waterline that we cannot see. So what does this all mean? Well, on a basic level, when in the 1960s and the 1970s, airlines enabled us to travel more easily and holidays abroad became more common, people were able to realize and see for themselves that if you changed country, you went to a different country, you would experience different food, a different language, different clothing. I think about, for example, going to India, or indeed going to the Middle East, where men and women have quite different clothing traditions to people in the West. Would those early travelers have necessarily been aware of or so aware of work ethic, humor, or the meaning of gestures? Probably not. And that's why, in many ways, they are important for us to raise awareness of in the ELT classroom. More of that in a few moments. So as we come towards the end of this first section, I think it's probably useful now to start thinking about what actually might be some definitions of culture. Now, before I show you the 4 definitions that I chose for us. I think it's important to say that in the same way as if I'd asked 10 of you to think about what comes to mind when you hear the word culture, almost certainly the same 10 people would come up with different definitions of culture. It's impossible here today to choose just one definition that is right for all of us. So as I show you these definitions on screen, I'd encourage you to perhaps choose one or two of them that you feel more comfortable with. And here they are. Now, some of these are very readily understandable. The way we do things around here, which actually is a definition I really like. Others are somewhat more nuanced, we might say academic. The collective programming of the human mind. So here we're moving from the locus of culture for being round here to actually being much wider, the human mind, and noticing this idea of the collective, the group. And that's really important to grasp when we're thinking about culture, because the group often is considered to be a nationality group, but it is so much more than that. Think about company culture. If you work for IKEA, your company culture may well be very different compared with working for a company like, I don't know, the Ford Motor Company. Some of these other definitions, the sum total, so it's the combination of beliefs, values and norms. So here, rather than the general term programming, we're drilling down into beliefs, values and norms shared by a group of people. And I think this is quite useful because it makes the point we're not just dealing about nationalities, we're talking about groups wherever we meet them. And then this one, which I find particularly interesting because of the word down here, accepted. All you need to know and believe in order to be accepted in a society. And therefore, arguably, can we say that culture leads to some form of following a mentality and of belonging, and therefore is it controlling, for example? These are all wider issues than we can discuss today, but hopefully this has helped to make you realize that when we talk about culture, we're actually looking at a complex area, but in terms of working smarter and our success as ELT practitioners, I think the following points are important. Firstly, if we have a basic understanding of what is meant by culture / cultures, this can inform our teaching and also help in this process of acculturation. In other words, enabling, if we are working in a country like the UK or America or Australia, where students from different cultures join us, it helps them to join the culture in which they're living in order to feel comfortable, in order to be accepted. But also as ELT teachers who are mobile, for us going to live in another country, this understanding will help us as we move and start teaching in different countries around the world, or possibly in different schools, again, because they, as groups, have different cultures. And then secondly, this understanding can pave the way for the classroom activities and can, I think, make the classroom a much richer, more enjoyable place to be. So on that note, let's move forward to the second part of this Gallery Teachers Masterclass, when we're going to look at the idea of published learning materials and what they can tell us about culture and what they can also tell us about the culture within which they've been written. So I'd just like to take a step back, if I may, by looking at these two publications, both written by the same author, David Gradle, who was an influential researcher who was looking at what he felt, based on the extensive research that he did, would be the future of English. This was his publication in 1997. And then a kind of a sequel to that, again, looking to the future, entitled English Next. Now, it's a gross oversimplification, but one of the things that David Gradle was alleged to have said, I think it was much more nuanced than this, was that general English was dead, or at least was on its way out. And that, I think, is a really interesting assertion, because if you work in a country like the UK, it's almost certain the number of your students studying general English remains very high. It may be the most or the largest group type that you teach. And if it's not the largest, it's almost certainly going to be one of the most important. So, this suggestion that general English will die sometime soon hasn't really ever happened yet. But nevertheless, we have seen a move in what general English looks like, and also a move towards more specialized courses. And this is something that I'm attempting to show on the next slide. So here we have what has perhaps rather cynically been described as tenor, teaching English for no obvious reason, which has been conflated with general English. And I think it's true to say, if we look back to the 1970s, the 1980s even, a lot of people were studying English with no obvious real aim. And of course, if you don't have a clear purpose, your motivation and your progress may well be affected. There was then a move towards the development of English for specific purposes and English for academic purposes. And then from the late 90s onwards, a massive, massive boom in the area of exam prep classes, and in particular IELTS. And I've just moved this above the other two, because I think these courses continue alongside the baseline of the general English programme. But as we'll see in the examples of materials that I'm going to show you, I think there's even been a shift in the general English coursebook. We heard a couple of months ago from Steve Hirschhorn talking about the importance of paring back and actually deciding what were the main things we should be focusing on, and questioning the role of critical thinking as something that is important in English language teaching. Should it be there? Many argue that it should. Many argue that we should now be using course material that reflects the more nuanced needs of the 21st century global student, looking at areas of English for study, English for work, and importantly, English for intercultural exchange. And therefore, there is a movement, I think, towards an overt focus in course materials on culture, both as a theme, but also as a learning outcome, that we are not only teaching grammar and vocabulary, but we are also teaching culture skills, and in particular, the skills of interculturality. Okay, so I thought it would be useful to have a look at representation and a range of coursebooks. This is the third edition of English File. English File is one of the best-selling English courses in the UK. And as I looked at this spread, it's 1B. So this is the second set of pages that students will ever see when they open this coursebook. This is, if memory serves me correctly, yes, it's the pre-intermediate edition. There are, I think, some interesting questions to ask. This is largely monocultural. Look at the faces. Look at the contexts in which these people are shown. These are affluent, largely white, middle-class people. That is the culture that the book both represents, but also puts forward, if you like, as the norm. So if the representation in this coursebook is for largely affluent, white, middle-class people, then what does that actually say about English language teaching and about the representation of the UK, for that matter? This is a global coursebook. It's not one that's produced for a specific country, be it Spain, Mexico, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, for example. But I think what is interesting is that we just have one image here in terms of BAME representation. Down here, we have man and woman going out for a meal. The lady is not very happy, I suspect, with what she's been given. and she's talking to the waitress. What does that tell us? Well, where are the queer lives here? We seem to have heteronormative couples, man and woman. And then we also have the waiting staff represented as a woman. And I think this is problematic. So our course books can perhaps reinforce cultural stereotypes. And what is interesting right now is that an organisation called English UK has very recently opened up an anti-racist group working party. And one of the things it's looking at is creating a more representative way of thinking about the experience for students coming to study and live in the UK, because I don't think what we see in these pictures here is a true representation of the experience of studying, living, working in the UK at all. So we now move to life, and I think we can immediately see some significant differences in terms of the treatment of culture. Number one, it's now an overt theme in the coursebook material. We are seeing representations of other cultures, including what might be described as minority cultures. And that term is not used in any way, shape, or form to suggest that it is less important, but that it has been made less important in terms of colonialism. So let me explain. What we have here is ethnic diversity. This particular photograph is representative of a minority culture within a larger country. So this is a Native American child living in America, but as a representative and as a member of a minority culture in that country. But the positive things here, I think, is that culture is now a topic and is to a lesser extent one of the learning points here, how we see other cultures. This isn't just the vocabulary of culture, but it's also how we think about cultural groups. It represents ethnic diversity. We've got Western cultures, Eastern cultures, different countries here codified through the meaning of colours in different cultures around the world. So yeah, we're still with nationality and ethnic culture here. This, I think, is truly interesting, however. This is Voices, a new title from National Geographic. It was launched only in late 2021. Here, interestingly, the title, Understanding Power Distance, cultural theory is now the topic. We're not just talking about manifestations of culture around the world, but we're actually teaching an understanding of cultural theory. Again, we have very mixed characters here in terms of their cultural mix. Roman is from Poland, David is Austria, and if we go over to the next page, we'll actually meet Zainab. Finally, I just wanted to touch on a teacher's book, because I think that's useful as well. And this is from Langauge Hub, and this is the A2 level. And I particularly chose the A2 level because I think it's important to make the point that culture can come in at any level, and it's good and important that it does. So on the one hand, this may appear to be relatively traditional content. So we're talking about countries and nationalities. We have the language of the present simple, B questions, positive and negative. And then in terms of vocabulary, everyday items, and then a bit more grammar, A and demonstratives. Nevertheless, I think even here, we are moving significantly and importantly into a strong representation of those 21st century skills. Let's think about the title of Arrivals, and also, and this is a picture of the student's book, the quotation that appears on the very first page of Unit 1. Visual literacy is now important. That's not necessarily directly related to culture, but of course, if we are visually literate, it will enable us to understand representations, not just in language, but also in visuals that we see. But also, and I think this is a key point, it's not by accident, I suspect, that Victoria Harbour has been chosen as the location here. This is a transitional location. It's one of those points from west to east, east to west. It's a liminal point. And also notice that the very standard traditional English, general English language of introductions has now been framed within the context of arrivals. The time when someone arrives at a place from somewhere else, entry, or indeed its reverse, homecoming. Here we are within the realm of culture exchange. We're in the realms of moving from culture A to culture B, and potentially we're opening up the opportunity to talk about culture shock and the wave, the W wave, that explains how moving from one culture to another and back again, reverse culture shock, and all of that from the topic of arrivals and a move from the language of greetings as function to functional and cultural. So actually, I think a very powerful demonstration of very embedded culture learning in a A2 level coursebook. And then I should add here at the end, the point about the quotation here, Socrates, I am a citizen of the world. And I think that's meant to represent the thoughts of the traveller sitting here. Very much here, we're in the realms of global citizenship. Because isn't it the case that as we're moving away from tenor, those students studying English, but they weren't really quite sure why, into a more nuanced landscape in which students have much more precise reasons for studying. For many of them, taking up their place as a learner in the global world is an important one, because for them to be successful, not only do they need linguistic skills, but they also need cultural skills to understand and negotiate the different cultures that they encounter. For many, that won't even be an English-speaking country. The learners of English around the world are doing so primarily to learn English as a contact language, to make contact through business and through study and academia with other people in other countries who share English with them as a second language. And therefore, to be successful, these students need to be global citizens and to have culture skills. So what does that all mean? Then I think as far as us as English language teachers, we need to consider that coursebooks and other published materials are all now, thank goodness, becoming much better at looking at culture. It's not just as a vehicle for language learning, but it's a point, a topic in its own right. Materials that are published for global markets may be problematic. We've seen, for example, in English File, how they tend to be unrepresentative. And therefore, it's important that if our materials that we're working with don't represent the reality of the students that we have in front of us, it may well be necessary for us to adapt materials or indeed create new ones of our own. So moving to the third and final point here of cultural dimensions, the point of this section is really to enable you to start thinking about culture. We're using a framework from intercultural skills. So I'm going to show you a number of pictures, and I'd like you to decide, if you can, for each set of pictures. Slide 2, next slide, there are 2 pictures. The slide after that, 3 pictures. And the third slide, a set of 2 pictures. What do you think is being represented in cultural terms? So there's our question. What aspect of culture do the next 3 slides represent? In this slide, 2 classrooms. This one, and then this one. We can see that they're very different, but can this be explained? And yes, it can, in cultural terms. Our next, the second of the 3 slides. two people, I'm not sure if they're arguing or if they're sharing a joke. It's difficult to say, but there is a clear direct exchange going on here, isn't there? Next picture, Mona Lisa, La Gioconda, famous for what was being described as her inscrutable smile. It's difficult to read what she's thinking. And then there's a bit of a hint for this one, this slide, low context and high context, and then some countries underneath it. And our third set of slides, here we have an Arab gentleman studying on his own. And here we have some ladies studying in a group. So what's happening in these pictures? Well, I've summarized on this next slide, and you can see in bold the titles of the so-called cultural dimensions, and above each, its manifestation in the picture. So in that first set of pictures, we not only saw two different classroom layouts, but potentially two different beliefs. And remember, beliefs are below the line in the iceberg, of two teachers. One who believes that the teacher's position is at the front of the class to control the class. The teacher is the high status individual. And in the second picture, a teacher who perhaps believes that their role is facilitator, and there is much closer relationship between the students and the teacher. The teacher is guide, not the one explaining, telling what to do. And this is all enshrined in what is known as the power distance dimension. The second one, as the third slide identified, is the difference between high and low context cultures, the extent to which the cultures are used direct and indirect communication. And the third one is this idea of individualism versus collectivism, the extent to which members of a culture tend towards working alone or working in groups. So these are just three examples of so-called cultural dimensions. And the quotation here on the slide, I think, explains very neatly what a cultural dimension is. So it summarizes, it codifies the extent to which cultural groups can be seen as nationalities, doesn't have to be, or most of the research looked at nationalities, are found empirically. So there's an evidence base to differ from one another in terms of psychological attributes. Don't worry too much about that. There's some examples, such as their values, their beliefs, their self-construals, how they create their own identities, their personality and their behaviors. So in terms of the classroom then, the power distance relationship, which, and there are three writers here who have looked at the whole idea of culture and cultural dimensions. Hofstede, a sociologist, looks at power distance as being the extent to which the less powerful members of an organization accept uneven power distribution. Do you therefore in the classroom as the student, the less powerful member, expect that you are less powerful and the teacher is quote unquote God? Or do you, as the teacher, believe that if you are closer in your power relationship to your students as a facilitator, learning will happen better as a result? Direct and indirect, the extent to which the massive communication is vested in the explicit code, basically, in that first photograph where there is a clear verbal exchange, what was going on could be understood from the language and the words that were used. In the second picture, Mona Lisa, it was very difficult to understand what she was thinking in words. We would need to look outside the words to understand the communicative act, what she's thinking. Then finally, Trompenas and his individualism and communitarianism, sometimes known as collectivism, is the extent to which behavior is seen as an individual or collective matter. Why are these important in the classroom? If you have students who come from a culture where there is an expectation of a large power distance, then the students will want and expect the teacher to act as a teacher. If they come into a culture where group work is much more common, they may think that the teacher is weak. Likewise, a teacher from a low power distance, moving to teach in an area where high power distance is the norm, setting up the classroom in a group way may be seen by the students as a very strange thing to do. It might lead to culture clash. Direct and indirect communication. Students from a background of high context, and Japan and China are examples, may well communicate in ways that are less, where everything other than the verbal is more important, reading between the lines. Whereas countries like, for example, Germany, where typically the verbal code communicates everything, put them together, you may well get miscommunication or failure of communication. Here, and an example from language schools in the UK, is that where a student is unhappy, for example, she or he, if they come from a collective or communitarian background, may come to reception to voice their complaints with all of their friends for support, because they see this as a group issue. Whereas in an individual culture, which to an extent the UK is, there may be the expectation that the student should come and complain on their own. Why are all their friends with them? It's becoming clear then that in all of these areas, that the cultural dimensions can help us to understand behaviours in the classroom and in the language school. And therefore, if we have an understanding of these cultural dimensions, we can begin to understand culturally codified behaviours better. And if we're moving to a new country or to a new group, then understanding these gives us a framework for analysing them. We must, of course, however, be careful of the dangers of stereotyping and othering. I deliberately chose a picture of an Arab male working individually to make the point that whilst students from Saudi Arabia come from a culture that is largely collective, nevertheless, not every single student will fit in to that code. And therefore, the danger of saying, well, all Arabs behave like this, well, not all of them do. And likewise, we should be wary about the danger of othering. In other words, centering everything on how we behave and making everything else different or other. If you're interested in learning more about this, I'll share with you in a moment a reading list. But here are the main concluding thoughts from this masterclass today. I hope it's become clear that the Japanese tea ceremony is a fascinating insight to Japanese culture, but there is so much more to culture than local traditions. We need to be wary of published materials. Often they represent a sanitized version of the target culture. And therefore, if we want there to be true representation, we need to make all parties in that visible. And then finally, cultural dimensions can aid understanding of both classroom and academic behaviours. Here's the reading list. This will be available on the Gallery Teachers website once this is shared a week after transmission. But if I can just remind you, not only this, but there is a whole range and wealth of other ELT workshops that are available on the Gallery Teachers website, and you can see them here. Culture is a really important aspect of both teaching and learning in English language teaching for a number of reasons. If you're working with students in a multinational class, you will have students coming to you from different cultures. Students are curious about each other's lives, but also may or may not understand each other's culturally codified behaviours. So working with cultural dimensions can help to lead to greater understanding and to greater empathy. If, like most teachers in the world, you're working in a monolingual classroom, Is therefore culture just as important? Yes, it is. And the reason for that is that many learners of English in monolingual contexts are doing so because they either aim to travel as tourists, or to study, or to work, either in English language speaking countries, or statistically more probably, they're using English as a contact language so that they can communicate in business or in academia with other speakers of English as a second language. There again, in those contexts, they will experience people from different backgrounds and different cultures. And the more that we look at culture, both as a topic, but also as a theme of our English language teaching lessons, the better equipped our students are for success. Absolutely, yes. There is a whole lot more to culture in EFL than talking about traditions. Traditions, of course, are really important. They're one of the visible manifestations of a culture. But it is also the case that there is so much more that we can be doing to enrich the experience, to create tolerance and understanding for our students, many of whom fit into that kind of concept of the 21st century learner. The learner who needs English for travel, for work, and for academia, for study. And by giving them not just these traditions, but equipping them as global citizens, we're providing them with key skills to enable them to be more effective global citizens in the future.